Assalamu alaikum. In this chapter, we are going to talk about theories of international trade and investment. We said before that international trade and investment are the two main components of international business. We saw before in chapter one, main concepts of international business, and we focused on explaining terms like exports, imports, global sourcing. We have been talking about the importance of international business for companies, for nations, for individuals, for the national wealth. We have been talking about the evolution of international business. And then in the second chapter, we addressed the phenomenon of globalization. Okay. We discussed, for example, the driver forces, the drivers of globalization, and then we have been talking about the consequences and the manifestations and consequences of globalization. We said that we have many manifestations at the firm level, the nation level. We discussed the globalization of the supply chain of firms. We discussed the globalization of production, the globalization of financial aspects, the globalization of many aspects, in fact, of the firm and the nation. Then we discussed the consequences of globalization at the firm level and at the national level. We said that there are many consequences that can be negative or positive for firms and nations: societal consequences, economic consequences, and thereby managerial consequences, managerial opportunities, business threats, business opportunities, of course. So we discussed this in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we focused on the environment, the cultural environment in which firms operate. We said that it is very important to take in consideration the cultural aspects when talking about international business, because these aspects can strongly impact the process of international business. Either we talk about investments or trade. We said that culture can affect every aspect of management. Okay, for example, we have been talking about negotiation patterns, about behaviors, about internal organization, and all these things. Okay, in chapter 4, we addressed the ethical aspects of international business. We have been talking especially about intellectual property rights and the abuse of labor and so on. In this chapter, we are going to talk about about theories and models and illustrations, explanations of international business. So before beginning, let's have a look on the learning objectives of this chapter. So you should be able to appreciate why nations trade. Okay, by the end of this chapter, students should be able to appreciate why nations trade. This is an important question. We will see later. You should be able to learn about how nations can enhance their competitive advantage. It is not enough to appreciate why nations trade, to understand why they trade, but it is also important to learn how can nations enhance their competitive advantage against others. Okay, we will see this in details later, inshallah. You should be able to understand why and how firms internationalize. It's not an easy question. You will see this later, inshallah. And finally, you should be able to explain the strategies that the internationalizing firms use to gain and sustain competitive advantage against others. So let's begin by exploring the main theories, the main categories of theories and tools used by specialists to explain international business, to explain international trade and investment. So we can say that we have in general two main categories. The first one is about nation level explanations. Okay, so these theories, these tools try to explain, to understand international business and trade, international trade and investment at the national level. The second category concerns firms. So when we talk about the first category, for example, we have basic questions that we can ask. For example, why do nations trade? And to answer this question, we have many theories. We have, for example, the classical theories, mercantilism, absolute advantage, the theory of Adam Smith, and David Ricardo's Comparative Advantage Principle, Heckscher-Ohlin factor proportions theory, Raymond Vernon International Product Life Cycle theory, and so on. We have many theories that try to answer the question, why do nations trade? It's not an easy question. We will see this later, inshallah. The second question that can be posed about international trade, how can nations enhance their competitive advantage? And here we have some contemporary theories, like, for example, the competitive advantage of nations, Michael Porter's Diamond Model and National Industrial Policy as tools to explain and understand and answer this question. When it comes to firm level explanations, we can ask questions like, for example, why and how do firms internationalize? Why firms internationalize? Why do they engage in international business? Why do they export? Why do they import? Why do they engage in joint ventures, for example? And to answer these questions, we have explanations like, for example, internationalization process of the firm. We can have tools like Born Globals and International Entrepreneurship to explain this trend of internationalization and to explain how can companies internationalize. Okay, we have another main question: how can internationalizing firms gain and sustain competitive advantage? And this is not easy. Okay, that's why we have many explanations, either based on FDI, foreign direct investment, or non-FDI explanations. For example, when it comes to FDI-based explanations, we have the monopolistic advantage theory. Monopolistic advantage theory tried to explain how can firms gain a sustainable competitive advantage. We have the internalization theory. We have Duning's eclectic paradigm also. All these tools and theories try to answer the question cited above. We also have non-FDI based explanations, for example, the international collaborative ventures, networking across the world, and so on. So let's begin by the first term in this chapter, the first main idea, the first main explanation of international trade, maybe the oldest one. It's about mercantilism. Okay, mercantilism is a concept, is a belief, is a school of thinking, okay, that was popular in the 16th century. Okay, this belief, according to this belief, the national prosperity results from maximizing exports and minimizing imports. Why? Because this was, according to them, according to the believers of this approach, this school of thinking, this was the only way to accumulate wealth, which was the symbol of the power of nations, of course. So they emphasized exporting, increasing exportings or maximizing exports and minimizing imports. So the main objective, the main purpose of trade was to accumulate wealth, to accumulate money, to accumulate gold, to accumulate some raw materials which were considered as a symbol of wealth. Today, some can argue that we have a rebirth, okay, in somewhat a rebirth of this approach, which is neo-mercantilism, which means the idea that the nation should run a trade surplus, more exports than more imports. Okay, so we can find among the supporters of this neo-mercantilism We can find supporters like, for example, labor unions who want to protect domestic jobs, farmers who want to keep crop prices high, and some manufacturers that rely on exports. Of course, these three categories of agents, or economic agents or stakeholders, prefer to run or to use the approach of of mercantilism. That's why we call them neo-mercantilists. It's important to notice there to mention that the term mercantilism is a bad term. It's relatively bad because it has a negative connotation. It is not easy to qualify someone mercantilist. Okay, mercantilism in our language, in today's language, is a bad term. It refers to someone who is very materialist, someone who doesn't care about values, about humans, and so on. Okay, so because the term comes from the period of mercantilism, where the main concern of people was to accumulate wealth and money, gold, silver, and so on. الفكرة الثانية, the second idea in this presentation is free trade. When we talk about free trade, we mean the absence of restrictions to the flow of goods and services among nations. عدم وجود عوائق أو قيود على تدفق السلع والخدمات بين الدول أو بين الأمم. Okay, free trade is usually best because it leads to many benefits. Okay, we said before that there is an agreement that free trade is good, is beneficial for all of us. Okay, there is a debate about the way these benefits are shared. تقاسم هذه المنافع وهذه الأرباح. Who benefits more from these benefits? Who can get profit from these benefits? Okay, it's not easy to judge, to determine who benefits more than others. But in general, we can say that free trade is usually best because it leads to more and better choices for consumers and firms. We said before that it's a matter of choice. Okay, capitalism is based on the idea of choice. If we have more choices, it's better for us. Okay, more choices about what we can produce, what we can consume, where we can place our money, where to invest, where to buy, where to sell. Okay, choices. So it's all about choices. The choice to do something, the choice to not do this thing. Okay, so more choices. Free trade is translated into more choices, and this is beneficial for all of us, of course. Also, it can lead to lower prices of goods for consumers and firms. Free trade can lead to lower prices of goods for consumers and firms. It's clear why, because we have more choices, we have more alternatives. That's why we can select the best one for us. Okay. It leads to higher profits and better worker wages because imported input goods are usually cheaper. Okay, it's a general rule. Okay, it's not always true, but in general it's true. Okay, because when we have more choices, we have better prices for our goods and services, or for inputs of production. So it's normal that we will be able to make better profits. Free trade also can also lead to higher living standards for consumers. Of course, because we have more choices, we have lower prices. Okay, we have less costs. Okay, we have more efficient production processes that will ultimately lead to better or higher living standards for consumers at the international level and at the national level. So the result of all this is more on greater prosperity in poor countries because they can get benefit from the free trade activities. This is the theory, but the reality is different sometimes. Okay, this is to be discussed later when talking about equity and sharing the benefits of international trade. Okay, The third idea that we want to talk about is comparative advantage. Okay, when we talk about comparative advantage, we will talk about a foundation concept of international trade. It answers the question of how nations can achieve and sustain economic success and prosperity. Okay, so the comparative advantage principle or concept refers to the superior features of a country, of a nation, that provide it with unique benefits in global competition. This comparative advantage makes a country, makes a nation specific, makes a nation unique against others, towards others. Okay, it has something special, it has something specific that makes it more powerful than others. Okay, so comparative advantage in general, a comparative advantage is derived either from natural endowments or from deliberate national policies. Okay, we will discuss this later, of course. We will have many examples to explain this idea. For example, if we want to talk about examples of national comparative advantage, when we talk about France, for example, we can say that France has a climate and soil superior for producing wine. That's why France has a comparative advantage in producing wine. While Saudi Arabia has a natural abundance of oil for the production of petroleum products, that's why Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage when we talk about petroleum products. Over time, okay, this is endowment. We are talking about endowment, okay? Endowment. But when we talk about Japan, for example, we can say that over time Japan has acquired a superior base of knowledge and experience for producing cars. Okay, this gives Japan a comparative advantage in producing cars. Okay, the same way India over time has acquired a superior base of IT workers for producing computer software. That's why we can say that India has acquired a comparative advantage, okay, in or for producing computer software. So what are the comparative advantages in your country? You can ask the question, what are the comparative advantages of Palestine, of Egypt, for example, of Jordan, or any country you can discuss. Okay. The fourth idea, okay, is about competitive advantage. Be careful, it's not the same thing. We were talking about comparative advantage. Now we are talking about competitive advantage. Okay, we were talking about advantage that was acquired by a country either by endowment, natural endowment, or by deliberate policies, okay, developed, okay, or taken by countries, okay, to have this comparative advantage, okay. But here we are talking about competitive advantage. It can be similar sometimes, when we talk about the results, but the concept is different, okay, it's pretty different. So competitive advantage is a foundation concept that explains how individual firms gain and maintain distinctive competencies relative to competitors that lead to superior performance. Okay, why IBM, for example, has a superior performance than other Chinese firms? Because they have something distinctive. They have some distinctive competencies relative to competitors. Okay, they have something that is different than others. So it refers to the distinctive assets, competencies, and capabilities that are developed or acquired by the firm. Okay, we are not talking about an endowment or about comparative advantage gained by deliberate policies of the nation. We are talking about firms that have developed, that have acquired or developed some specific assets, some distinctive assets or competencies or skills or capabilities, okay, or we'll talk later about this, okay, that made this firm powerful vis-a-vis its competitors, okay? Of course, the collective competitive advantage held by the firms in a nation are the basis of the competitive advantage or the advantages of the nation at large, okay? So the sum of these advantages, the sum of these competitive advantages can be seen as the competitive advantages of the nation at large, okay? Let's talk about some examples of firm advantages or firm competitive advantages. For example, when we talk about Dell, Dell's prowess in the management of its global supply chain can be considered as a competitive advantage of Dell. Okay, their courage, their prowess in the management of its global supply chain, their openness is a competitive advantage of Dell. When we talk about Samsung, we can mention their technological leadership in flat panel televisions. Okay, this made them very powerful. This is a competitive advantage of Samsung. When we talk about Cadbury, we mention the capabilities of Cadbury in international marketing and distribution. They have a strong network of marketing and distribution, and this gave them a competitive advantage. If we talk about Herman Miller, okay, we can think about the design, the strength in design in office furniture. Okay, for example, iron chairs, which have been very familiar through many years. So now we understand what's the meaning of mercantilism. We understand the meaning of free trade. We discovered the concept of comparative advantage. We described the concept of competitive advantage and contrasted these two terms. Now let's begin by talk about the principle of absolute advantage. Okay, we are still talking about theories, explanations, tools, models that explain international trade and investment. Okay, so we began by mercantilism. Now we are talking about absolute advantage principle. Okay, so this principle developed by Adam Smith, okay, in the early 18th century. Okay, this principle says that a country should produce only those products in which it has absolute advantage or can produce using fewer resources than another country. Okay, let's explain that. We have two countries. We suppose that we have only two countries, that can produce only two products. Okay, for example, we have France and Germany. Both of them can produce cloth or wheat. Okay, so if we make this table, this matrix, okay, so France, Germany, cloth, wheat. Okay, so the unit used here is 1 ton of cloth, 1 ton of wheat. We use the quantity here expressed here are expressed in labor cost in days of production for 1 ton. Okay, so this for France, for example, to produce 1 ton of cloth, they need 30 days of production. Okay, France needs 40 days, 30 labor days to produce 1 ton of wheat, while Germany needs 100 labor days, okay, of production to produce 1 ton of clothes, and 20 labor days to produce 1 ton of wheat. So it's clear that this is cost. We are talking about cost here. Okay, we are talking about costs. For example, so it's clear here, for example, that for Germany it's more expensive to produce clothes than France. Okay? And contrarily, for France, it's more expensive to produce wheat than Germany. So it's clear that if they were rational, that France should produce and export wheat, while Germany, clothes, while Germany should export and produce and export wheat. Okay, is this clear? So we say here that France has an absolute advantage in producing clothes. Okay, so France can produce clothes, the same quantity of clothes, using less quantity of labor force, less quantity of labor days, with lesser cost. Okay, while Germany can produce wheat with lesser cost or with less working days than or lesser than France. Okay, less than France. That's why we can say that Germany has an absolute advantage in producing wheat, while France has an absolute advantage in producing clothes. This explains why France has interest to trade with Germany and why Germany has interest to trade with France. So it's easy, it's clear. Everyone should produce only those products in which it has absolute advantage or can produce using fewer resources than another country. Okay, this is easy, this is simple, this is beautiful, but this is not true all the time, because one can ask many questions about this argumentation. Okay, there are many. Okay, this argumentation is based on many assumptions. Okay, they assume that, for example, there is only two countries. They assume that we have only two products. They assume that both countries use the same technology of production. They assume that there is no cost for transporting, no transport costs from Germany to France, France to Germany. All these assumptions make the argumentation fragile. Okay, it can be questions at any moment. But this is not the problem. The problem is, the main problem of this argumentation, the main problem of this theory is the following. Suppose that France and Germany, France has an advantage, an absolute advantage in both clothes and wheat. Okay, so let's change these numbers. Okay, so France, for example, okay, you can see the opposite, it's the same thing. Okay, we can express these numbers in terms of production for one day of production. We can express them in tons of clothes. Okay, so here we are talking about cost. So here Germany has an advantage, an absolute advantage in both clothes and wheat. Okay, so it is beneficial for Germany to sell products to France. But is this normal that France doesn't do anything but importing from Germany? Is this acceptable for both of them? Is this encouraging for making or for trading between them? The answer is not. It's no, absolutely, because there is no advantage. There is no absolute advantage for France in this situation. So, what makes France trade with Germany if it hasn't any advantage, any absolute advantage? The answer is more complex. So it is beneficial for two countries to trade even if one has absolute advantage in the production of all products. Okay, what matters is not the absolute cost of production, but the relative efficiency with which it can produce the product. Okay, this is worth a good explanation. Okay, so let's take this example. Two men can make both shoes and hats. Okay, two men can make shoes and hats, and one is superior to the other in both employments. Okay, first this one, okay, is superior than this one in both hats and shoes. Okay, he has an absolute advantage in both hats and shoes. Okay, but in making hats, be careful, but in making hats, he can only exceed his competitor by 1/5 or 20%. Okay, his advantage against his competitor in hats is only 20%. He can exceed his competitor by 20% only when it comes to hats. But when it comes to shoes, when it comes to making shoes, he can exceed him by 1/3 or 33%. So anyway, he is exceeding his partner, his competitor. But in hats, he exceeds him only by 20%, while in shoes, he exceeds him by 33%. Okay? Well, it not be for the interest of both that the superior man should employ himself exclusively in making shoes and the inferior man in making hats. This was the idea of David Ricardo, 1817. Okay, so we are not looking at the absolute cost, the absolute advantage, the absolute cost of the absolute productivity or efficiency of production between them, but we look at the ratio between the two products produced by every producer, by each one of them, by each country. Okay, because this will lead us to sacrifice one product for the interest of the other product. Okay, so by sacrificing one product, okay, it's the opposite here actually. By sacrificing one product, we can devote our resources to one product that is in which we are more efficient. And by selling this product to my competitor or to another nation, I can import more of the other product than if produced by myself. Okay, I don't know is it clear or not. So let's take another explanation. While Germany can make both items cheaper than France, it is still beneficial for Germany to trade with France. The key is the ratio of production costs. The ratio of production costs. In the exhibit, we saw that Germany is comparatively more efficient at producing clothes than wheat. Okay, it can produce 3 times as much clothes as France, so 3-1, 30-10. Okay, but only 2 times as much wheat. In both cases, in both products, Germany is more efficient than France. Okay, but in clothes, it's more efficient than wheat. Okay, in clothes, it can produce 3 times as much as France, but only 2 times as much wheat as France. So Germany should specialize in producing clothes and import all the wheat it needs from France. France should specialize in producing wheat and import all its cloth from Germany. Each country benefits by specializing in the product in which it has a comparative advantage and importing the other product. If we have a little small calculation, we'll find that the result of this transaction would be better for both countries. So the principle is clear. It applies to all goods. It reveals how countries use scarce resources more efficiently to produce products in which they are more efficient than others. Okay? We have concrete examples to illustrate this idea. For example, arguably, no country is better than Japan at making cars and cell phones. It's clear. But because Japan is especially good at making cars, it concentrates its resources on making them. They don't make a lot of cell phones and other things like this. Okay, they focus on cars because they are more efficient in cars than other things. Other countries such as China and Finland, for example, focus on making cell phones. Okay, in this way, Japan makes maximal use of its resources. Okay, to produce something in which it is very efficient, and the world gets great cars. Okay, so these theories are not perfect. Okay, they are good tools to explain, to understand the patterns of trade, but they are not perfect. So they have some limitations. Okay, they fail to account, for example, for international transportation costs. We said before that they don't take in consideration international transportation costs because sometimes for some products transportation costs can change the equation. Everything can be different when we talk about transportation costs. When we take in consideration transportation costs, things may be different. Okay, sometimes governments can distort normal trade by selectively imposing protectionism, for example, tariffs or quotas, or investing in certain industries via subsidies, for example. This can distort normal trade and competition. So these theories cannot explain why, for example, Spain or France can still export apples, for example, for third world countries. It's not normal, it's not comprehensible, but sometimes protectionism and policies and trade policies can lead to this result without any doubt. Okay. Another limitation when we talk about services. Okay, some services can be traded, others cannot be traded freely via the internet. Some of them can be traded, some cannot be traded, okay, easily. So when we talk about software, about consultation, about insurance, these services can be easily traded via the internet or global telephony, but other services cannot be easily traded. So these theories cannot explain all of these services, the patterns, the trade patterns of these services. Okay. For many firms, scale economies and superior business strategies provide efficiencies and other advantages. These efficiencies cannot be explained by early trade theories. Early trade theories fail to account for this. For example, Japan lacks comparative advantages, but its firms succeeded anyway via superior strategies. So these theories could not explain, anticipate, take in considerations this idea of superior strategies that can lead to comparative advantage. Okay. Another important theory in the classical approach, okay, that tried to explain, in fact, to explain how people or how countries can have a comparative advantage. Okay, it is to complete. It was completing. It was complementary theory to other theory, to all the old theories of Adam Smith and Ricardo. Okay, so this theory says that okay, international trade is made because, or the comparative advantages of countries are made because each country should produce and export products that intensively use relatively abundant factors of production and import goods that intensively use relatively scarce factors of production. For example, Russia has abundant lands, had lots of lands. Okay, so Russia will export products that depend on lands, that are based on lands as a resource. Okay, while China has a lot of qualified labor, so the expected products or exports of China will be products that are based on labor force. Okay, the United States, for example, they have a lot of capital. Okay, that's why the products exported by the United States will be very capital intensive. Okay, this was the main theory of Heckscher-Ohlin. Okay, Heckscher-Ohlin, two economists that developed this theory, which is called factor endowment theory or factor proportion theory. Okay, or Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So this theory tried to explain why or how nations can be more efficient in producing some products and not in other products. Okay. However, the real chief, okay, this theory was powerful. It has helped to explain many aspects of the trade patterns then, but the relative paradox revealed that countries can successfully export products that use less abundant resources. For example, the US often exported labor-intensive goods. So this is paradoxal. Okay, that's why we call it relative paradox, because we expected that the US would export capital-intensive goods, but his data showed that the United States often export labor-intensive goods. Okay, so it's not easy. This implies that international trade is very complex. It cannot be fully explained by a single theory. So, as we said before, it's a toolbox that can be or that must be used carefully and with a lot of care. The last theory, I think, in this wave of theories, before we stop and finish part 1 of this chapter, actually, this is an important theory to explain the case of the United States. Okay, the capital goods exported by the United States and then imported by the United States. This is a theory that tried to explain some patterns of trade. Okay, it was paradoxical to see, for example, that the United States, who invented computers, who was the first innovators of cars, becoming a big importer of cars and computers. So this theory is simple. All of us know what's the theory of product life cycle. Okay, we studied this in marketing, in innovation. Okay, and creativity. All of you know about this theory. Okay, but here we use this theory at the international level differently. Okay, it's a bit different because we are talking about the international product life cycle theory. Okay, it's the same idea, exactly. In general, it's the same idea. Each product and its associated manufacturing technologies go through 3 stages of evolution. 3 stages, 4 stages, 5 stages. Okay, it's the main idea. We can exclude, for example, the conception and development phase, and the last one, which is the decline phase. Okay, let's focus on the 3 main stages or phases of through which a product passes or goes. Okay, So the first one is introduction, the second one is maturity, and the third one is standardization. Okay, we can add growth, the growth phase, or the phase of growth, the stage of growth, in the basic theory. But here we are not interested by this phase actually, because we are focusing on three main phases. Okay, to understand how products invented in the United States, okay, are produced by other countries and imported by the United States. Okay, so the first one is introduction. The first stage is introduction. In this stage, in the introduction stage or phase, the inventor country enjoys a monopoly both in manufacturing and exporting the product. For example, the television set was invented in the United States and developed in the United States, and naturally it was exported by the United States in this phase of the product, of the life of the product. Okay, but in the maturity stage, the second stage of this product, the product's manufacturing becomes relatively standardized. Other countries start producing and exporting the product. Okay, so it's the role of the tour of China, Japan, and other countries to begin to produce television sets, and then these products become relatively standardized. Anyone or everyone can do them, anyone can manufacture them. Okay, so this leads us to the third phase, which is the standardization stage. Okay, so in this stage, manufacturing ceases in the original innovator country, here the United States. So the United States stops to produce television sets, okay, which is the innovator country, and it becomes a net importer of the product. So it imports more TV sets than it exports. Okay, so today, under globalization, for many products, the cycle occurs quickly. Okay, so innovator countries begin by developing, conceiving, developing, introducing a product. Many 10 or 15 years later, this original country, this innovator country, begins to import more products than it exports. This explains some aspects of international trade patterns at the international level. I think we will stop here, inshallah. So it's the end of part 1. This video to be continued, inshallah, in part 2, next video. Assalamu alaikum.